Oh.
We're live now.
Good morning and welcome to the Renewable Energy Standard Working Group. We are convening our meeting and actually I think it would be helpful because I know there's at least one and I think I'm seeing another two on screen of members who have proxies present. And so I think it would actually be helpful for everyone if proxies would just announce that you're here representing your organization today. If you could do that. So,
hi, my name's Heather Darcy. I'm representing VEPSA in place for Ken Nolan.
Welcome. Great. And Joey, are you representing BNRC today?
No, I am not. I anticipate Brian being there.
Okay, great. Thanks.
I'm just lurking.
That's allowed. All right. Well, I'm not sure we have too much on opening remarks other than just to say welcome, and we're back at it. And then I will hand it over to our facilitator, Jennifer Nauer, to go through the agenda.
Okay, let me share my screen. So the morning we'll start off the day with some announcements. There's several different items there. Conflict of interest, discussion and clarity, decision-making procedure, and timeline and anticipated topics of the meetings 3 through 8, which is something that we might come back to at the end of this meeting as we set the agenda for the time forward. The first hour of the meeting is really engaging in task 1. You're going to see a lot of overlap with your homework between meeting 1 and today. You can anticipate some interactive polling and a lot of discussion there. I will be taking notes on the screen. So for those of you for whom that screen is too far away to really see what I'm writing, so check the Google Doc and pull that up. It's a view only. Anyone while I'm streaming can use that too. That's a good way to dial in your visual if this screen is too distant. Break at 9:50. When we come back from the break, you'll hear from the Department of Public Service response to some of your concerns and questions around the scenarios, omissions. 10:40, another brief break. And before we close, leaning into task 2. What are the barriers to moving to 100% renewable energy standard for all electrical utilities by 2030? That piece will include a brief presentation and then also facilitated discussion with note-taking on the screen. So that Google Doc, if you don't like looking at the visual up on the screen there, it will be helpful for you to pull up. Public comment today is at 11:30. If you are listening and you haven't signed in with Sorsha yet, you'd like to have the other public comment you'd like to share, please email Sorsha Anderson. Our email is on the agenda, posted on the website. Next steps at 11:45 and then adjourn at noon. Any questions about the agenda? Announcements.
Now we are into announcements.
Sure. So good morning. Good to be back with all of you. In terms of our first announcement around the notion of a potential conflict of interest. Vermont is a small state. We see many of each other on many different panels, many different ways. And so there are times where there are relationships that we just want to make sure that everyone in the room is aware of as we work on a problem together. Co-Chair Sheldon and I became aware of a potential conflict of interest because we didn't have a piece of information prior to convening, and that was a piece of information disclosed, but during the hiring process for our facilitator, Jen Nauer, but we weren't aware of it. It was so disclosed during the request for proposal process. We simply didn't know of it. And so with an eye towards being entirely transparent, open and respectful to having a healthy public process, we wanted to pause now before going forward with the meeting and address that. So with that, I think the next person I'd like to turn to is Catherine Benham, who can explain the process that brought the information forward to us.
Good morning. I'm Catherine Benham. I'm the Chief Fiscal Officer in the Joint Fiscal Office. And I'm here to talk about this in the context of contracting with Jen Nauer. First, to let everybody know that Chair is correct. In her response to the RFP, she did state that her spouse works for the PUC. So she was very clear about that up front. We at the Joint Fiscal Office did not view it as a conflict of interest because she was bringing her skills as a facilitator, not a subject matter expert. So she's bringing in, her own set of skills on that. Specifically, what we viewed her work as is managing the discussion so everybody has a chance to participate, making sure the discussion moves forward, assisting chairs with the agenda planning, developing activities and visuals that help with the discussion, asking questions, managing conflict, finding places of agreement. She was not hired, again, as a subject matter expert, and she has no expertise, I would say. I will let her speak for it, but my understanding, she has no expertise in energy policy. And her role does not include making recommendations, informing content, or offering legislative advice. So that is not, she's not here for that. She's here to help facilitate the discussion. The way I view it is she's facilitating the discussion, not talking about the content. She's not providing advice on the content of the discussion. And I would say nobody likes surprises. I regret that we didn't bring this up earlier. And in the future, we have a plan in our office to, just if there's ever any kind of issues like this, to bring it to the chairs immediately when we find out about it. In conclusion, I guess I would say I would appreciate that we've had this discussion and the question was raised. It's prompted another review of the role of the facilitator. I think we're a lot clearer about what the role is. There's more clarity in all of the roles. And I think, Jen, maybe I will turn it over to you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I share that appreciation. And also the sense, I think one of you tried to prompt this discussion at the first meeting, and I was paying attention to so many other things that we didn't vet it. So full disclosure, I'm married to Tom Nauer, who's in a leadership role at the Vermont Public Utility Commission. He's the policy director. So exploring conflicts of interest as a facilitator, it's a legitimate question and it's a great question, helpful to clarify. And there's the formal piece about content expertise or whether I'm making decisions, but there's also the informal piece about whether you feel like you can work with me in this role and do your best work here. So I do want to walk through my job with your ear towards that, see to what extent am I going to be able to help you do your work, or is this proximity going to be a hindrance? So my expertise is in process. I'm always thinking about ways to structure the conversations you have here so they're productive, in service to tasks 1 through 8, and that they're a good use of your collective time. So to that end, I'm providing agendas, visuals, activities that I think will help you do your work together. Facilitation, these working group meetings to keep discussion on track, and potentially facilitation of small groups if that comes up and if it's needed. Summary notes where applicable of takeaways. So here's what my job isn't, and I think you review this pretty well, but I want you to just tend to, I'm not giving content advice or evaluation of any of the substantive materials. You wouldn't want me to. I don't have that. It's not my wheelhouse. I'm not giving legal advice or providing a gatekeeping function to the topics that you cover here. That's the role of your co-chairs. And all of you as a group. So what I am listening for is what is the relevant territory that you want to cover here, and how can we make room for it in the collective agenda? I'm also not working with you individually on your negotiating process or your position within this group. And that really is a role that mediators often play when they step into a private, confidential process. I'm a mediator, sort of a funny role in this kind of setting. And so I think that's a real point of distinction, that I'm not carrying that shuttle work in between individual parties, but instead really helping this collective time run well. You need to know your remedies or options for recourse just in case, as you move along, you see trouble. And it would probably show up in one of two areas. One is that if you notice bias in my handling of this group process, it's important for you to know what your recourse is. 2 immediate options. 1, to let me know in case it's literally an unknowing, something you know about your world which is not clear to me, so I can make an adjustment. The second is to let any of your legislative members on this team know so they can bring it up with the co-chairs and make a course correction if necessary. I do encourage you to be as specific as you can about that concern so that they can really figure out what the best recourse would be. So a less obvious concern, and then I'll wrap this up, is your ability to be candid with me. That's when we think about conflict of interest as a mediator or impartial role. That's the piece that we're worried about the most. Something I'm wondering is the extent to which my proximity to Tom Nauer, a person in a leadership position at the Public Utility Commission, affects your ability to fully participate in this effort with me in the facilitator role. And so to address this, there's two options, and then I'll open it up for a couple of questions. One, my job description for this particular working group might mitigate some of that concern. I am not very available and probably not even very helpful, given the technical nature of this content, to be a sounding board for your negotiation position or but I do want to know the topics that are of concern to you so we can get them into the agenda. What I'm available for and doing my best to accomplish is to outline clear homework and agendas so that you can think through those positions with your constituents and with the other people that you work with, and then bring that back to the meeting. If, however, you still have concerns or had different expectations for the work that was going to unfold in this group, in particular the convener role or facilitator role, please let the co-chairs know so they can take it into account when assessing options going forward. We can take a couple of questions. I want to be careful about how much time we take, but you can follow up with your co-chairs if you have them and we can't answer them here. Does anybody have any questions for me?
Any concerns or things you want to discuss around this topic? Yeah.
It seems fantastic, and I think we're lucky to have her here.
I appreciate you guys doing this in an open way, and I think that's terrific. It's Vermont. I have different relationships with every single person around this table in different ways. So appreciate the heads up. Thank you.
And I would say that there's, even if it's a good service I can provide and it's fantastic, if it gets in your way, that's still a legitimate piece that is, and you have an avenue to address it. So I think the interest really is in helping you do your best work.
Looks like Chris Pearson has his hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that discussion, Jennifer. I'm not personally concerned about it, but I guess I would point out for fiscal staff and others, this process is pretty well guaranteed to frustrate everybody. We're working in an extremely divisive political time, and this topic has bubbled for years precisely because it's very difficult to thread the needle, which is I think the genesis of this working group. So I would just ask for down the road for staff to think about that. I mean, if we're all saying we're comfortable with this around the table, but there are many other observers who are now sort of going to be convinced, rightly or wrongly, that this is rigged, I think that's a real problem, and it undermines the purpose here. And so we're probably not something we can deal with now, but I just would encourage folks to recognize the much bigger picture than how we personally feel about it and the process that we're engaged in frankly, because of the times that we're in, are not one with abundance of trust in public process.
And while we have Catherine Benham with him, any questions on that side for joint fiscal? So I did want to thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Jen. We had the co-chair and I had conversations as part of preparing for today, and we were come back to something that Jen said. She's here to facilitate process, and we're not relying on expertise on content, which is really the real contribution you all bring forward. The other thing was that this moment we're sharing now, the person's point was that we want to make sure that everyone does have faith in the process, because we're bending over backwards to make sure that we're as transparent and respectful with every participant and any member of the public following. If anyone has any concerns, I know we said any questions now. It's maybe somewhat awkward to raise your hand in a public forum. If you have questions, the chair and I would love to hear from you. You can do that privately on any time, and that's not just today, but all the way throughout the whole process. And then the last thing Jen mentioned was agendas. You know, we want this to be a working group that answers questions that you have as well as other people in the group have. So please always weigh in with us on what you'd like to see in future agendas.
All right. Will you walk us through the decision making?
So we went through a decision-making process at the end of meeting 1. It was very quick. I think the reason we wanted to bring it up is so that you could put your eyes on the text between meeting 1 and meeting 2. So I can pull it up on my screen. If you want to review it, you can go ahead or review it. We didn't make significant changes to it, but you hadn't gotten a chance to see the text. I think we just wanted to pause there, especially in the context of all these discussions about how decisions are made. It's going to be taking a second to catch it. Is there anything you wanted to note about the decision-making process?
I guess, did anyone have any thoughts about it after we did go through it at the previous meeting? Concerns?
Share it on the screen. Probably you're all thinking this is one of the details in the agenda that you didn't pay attention to. That's okay. The gist is that it's a modified consensus building process. In the event that decision must be made among this group and consensus has not been reached, the following shall apply. Quorum must be present in order for a vote to take place. It means 50% of the working group members are present in the meeting. I believe right now you have 20 people in the committee. It's a simple majority vote. Proxy votes are permitted. We did request at the end of last meeting that you all decided that if a working group member needs to send a proxy to give us 24 hours in advance notice if possible. And that's a practical matter too, so we can make sure we have the right people in the meeting and count our numbers. You also can send information relevant to the agenda in advance. Is there anything else here that you wanted to forecast or highlight? Any questions? Yes.
Good morning. My name is Brian Evans-Munchen. I'm the new general manager for the Village of Hyde Park. Unfortunately, I was not able to attend the last meeting. But one question I have is relative to what you were just citing. In the memorialization of the discussion, will there be minority positions represented in the write-up so that if in fact we were part of a minority comment, that would be reflected?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So I think we're still trying to figure out what the documents that arrive out of this working group look like. There's draft legislation called for, and then also if there's any summaries you can come up with around tensions or barriers, even if they're not decisions, but it's information about the landscape, all of you can use, but then others could use too going forward. Absolutely.
Great. Thank you very much.
Did you want to look at the timeline?
Why don't we save that for the next steps in homework? Because I think they'll have more information. And the reason I'm suggesting that is all of you as a working group, to your point earlier, will have some insight around where to go next in meetings 3 and 4 in particular. So let's pull up the timeline then. I'm sorry?
We already did on the last meeting, actually.
But I think Alan's point is good, that if there are a couple of additions, maybe yes and choose.
Yes.
I can pull it up. To adopt, what that means is that you're asking for a simple majority according to this. Is that what you're asking for, Alan?
We need a motion.
Yeah. So any discussion of, well, we need a motion to adopt. committee? Thank you. Any discussion? Okay. Then all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Anyone opposed?
Aye.
Anyone opposed, please say nay. Okay, so we've adopted the decision-making process. Thank you. To our new member, just wanted to say very briefly on the minority report question. So since you weren't here, we also said in addition to minority report, this working group precedes legislative action next session. So there'll be a chance to speak again directly to committee if and when legislation comes forward.
Great, thank you.
Jace?
Thank you. I just had a question about the process for voting. Just given that we are in a hybrid scenario, and so there are folks online who would need to unmute to vote. I'm wondering if perhaps we could just build in sort of like a two-part process for the voting where we just give an extra couple of beats for folks who are online to unmute and either say yay or nay, please. Thanks.
Great consideration for sure.
Catherine just let us know that we understand folks over here may be having a hard time hearing, so everyone just keep that in mind and project when we're talking because of the construction outside the window.
Are you ready to move on to agenda item 9?
We are.
9, the 9 o'clock, right? It's actually engaging task number 1, so changes to Vermont's existing renewable energy requirements. This agenda item includes, again, public components, a brief presentation from Legislative Council about the Renewable Energy Standard and Energy Policy Statute Review, brief poll, facilitated discussion. This is one of those places where I'll be taking notes on the shared screen, so if you would like to have that Google Doc open, the link is in your agenda. Ellen. Are you ready? And would you like me to pull up a presentation?
Yes, please. Ellen Tchaikovsky, Office of Legislative Counsel. I'm back. So part of your homework this week was to review Chapter 89 of Title 30, which is the Energy Programs Chapter and Statute. I'm going to quickly review a few of those statutes to do the sort of the formal introduction to the Renewable Energy Standard as it currently is drafted in statute, as this is the statute that your committee is going to be working on and looking at. So you can go to the first slide, Jen. Thank you. So Section 8001 of Title 30 is the purpose and goals of the Renewable Energy Standard. I don't have it up on the slide, but it was part of the reading you were supposed to do. So hopefully you reviewed it to see that there are actually statutory goals formalized in 8001. There are additional goals in 8005 for each of the tiers. And I'm not going to touch on them, but that was part of the discussion that came up last week. Section 8002 is the definition section for all of the issues we're about to talk about. But 8004 establishes the Renewable Energy Standard. And in subsection A, what's on slide 2 here is the primary directive of the Renewable Energy Standard. So a retail electricity provider, which is a distribution utility, including the newest distribution utility, Global Foundries, shall not sell or provide electricity in the state without ownership of sufficient energy produced by renewable energy plants or sufficient renewable energy credits from plants whose energy is capable of delivery in New England that reflect the required amounts of 8005. So 8005, which I'll go to on the next slide, establishes the RES categories, which is what we also call the tiers. There are 3 tiers of the RES. Tier 1 is total renewable energy. So total renewable energy requires that the distribution utilities each own renewable energy credits for total amounts of renewable energy within their supply portfolio, And so this was set initially at 55% of each utility's annual retail electric sales beginning in 2017 and increasing an additional 4% every third January thereafter until reaching 75% in 2032. So when we refer to 75% by 2032, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about tier 1. And the discussion you'll be having about task 2, which is the conversation around 100% by 2030, that refers to changing the requirements of tier 1. So one of the big discussions as part of this category is, I've also included on this slide, though you can't read it because it's a lot of text, is the definition of renewable energy standard as defined in 8002 for this program. So it is the sort of basic renewable energy definition, which is technology that relies on a resource that is being consumed at a harvest rate at or below its natural regeneration rate. Vermont does prohibit the use of nuclear fuel to count in this category, but otherwise it covers the other things that you traditionally think of. So wind, hydro, solar, geothermal, as well as the landfill gases and agricultural gases. And then within the definition of renewable energy, it's further broken down into existing renewable and new renewable. Tier 1 allows any renewable energy that meets this standard to count towards the amount. So going on to the next slide is tier 2. Tier 2 requires distributed renewable generation. So the utilities must have a certain percentage of distributed renewable generation within their portfolio. And what this means, it starts at 1% of each utility's annual retail electric sales beginning in 2017. It increases an additional 0.3% each year until reaching 10% in 2032. For purposes of this section, distributed renewable generation means one of the following: renewable energy that is new and has a plant capacity of 5 megawatts or less, and is connected to one of the retail electricity providers' distribution systems, or is a net metering system. So one of the distinctions in tier 2 is the requirement that it be new renewable energy. I've included that definition also on this slide, but again, it is in section 8002. And new renewable starts for any plant that came into service after June 30th of 2015. Prior to June 30th of 2015, that's considered existing renewable, but for tier 2, it has to be in the new category. And then on to the last slide is tier 3. Tier 3 is energy transformation. So this is slightly different. Tier 3 requires starting at 2% of each utility's annual electric retail sales, increasing an additional 0.2% until reaching 12% in 2032. And so it requires either additional distributed renewable generation, not counted towards, so if they've already met their tier 2 requirements and they have extra distributed, they can count it towards their tier 3 requirements, or energy transformation projects, or they can do a combination of both. So I've included on here as well the eligibility for what counts towards this. Again, it has to be after 2015, so sort of in the new category. But then over the lifetime for these energy transformation projects, the project have to result in a net reduction of fossil fuel consumed by the customer. And then they also need to represent the lowest present value life cycle costs, including environmental and economic cost. And they have to cost the utility less than the alternative compliance payment. So the Public Utility Commission sets what types of projects are actually eligible to meet the energy transformation project category. They use the technical advisory group, the TAG, to evaluate the different projects that could be eligible. Utilities are allowed to apply and ask which to have a decision made if a project can be eligible. And then the tag also sets how much each project is worth. And there's some math that needs to go into this because unlike the other two tiers that use megawatt hours, there has to be a conversion between the reduction in fossil fuel use to the megawatt hours. So there are people that look at that. And so that's the really quick version. I know that I missed some of the details in here. Like, for example, the energy that's in tier 2 counts towards tier 1 because it is part of the total renewable, but not tier 3. But I think I was only allotted 10 minutes, and so I think I made it. I can answer questions, so I think most of the people in this room have been working within the RES for a long time.
I have one quick question, just to make sure that I'm right and my understanding is correct. As load growth increases for each utility, so does the requirements under the RES. In other words, the percentage requirements, if you saw a 10% increase, you need to increase your percentage 10% under each of the requirements as well, correct?
Yes, so each year's, the amount that's due each year is based on the prior year's retail sales. So if there is a significant increase, you're going to have to adjust the percentage based on that increase.
Thank you.
Within,
What do you mean?
What was the question?
I said within the year?
So it's, I believe it's on a calendar year basis, and so you have to look back and based on what last year's retail electric sales number was, then you have to figure out what that percentage is due for that year.
Thank you. So I think it's there are none. Other questions? So I think we're ready to go into the warm-up.
So meeting 1, you're talking about what does a successful renewable energy standard look like? And the discussion actually will move us relatively quickly towards where you've identified where the statute's intention with your goals. Let's start with a poll warm-up. You've got these bright colored cards. Those of you who are online, I emailed you or I texted you the link directly so you can access this interactive poll. The results are aggregate, they're anonymous, they show up in real time. Use the QR code or you can go to the website that's mentioned there. I'll pull up on my screen results so that you can see them come in.
What about people who can't do it on this QR code?
If you can't do it on the QR code, you can go to this website, menti.com.
Speak louder, please.
I can. This information is going to be more for I won't repeat the details because the survey link folks have. But let me go ahead and I'll open up this is just for the working group members. You all set? You don't see a question yet, but you will now. All the way here. To what extent does the current RES framework align with your sense about what a successful renewable energy standard does? 1, not at all aligned. 5, very aligned. Part of what this warm-up does is just give a little visual about where how the group is walking into this conversation and identifying specific tensions that you'd like to see more in alignment. So what you can see in that visual that's popping up, the peaks and valleys, the higher the peak, the more responses are there. So the numbers.
Jan, this is Shayna Loisel. I do not have the link. I can go to menti.com, but it's asking for a code.
Go ahead and put it in the chat to you again.
Thank you.
So I wonder what this tells you, just this visual, while we wait for a couple more folks. What stands out? Go ahead.
Well, if I had to guess, I would say the utility people all said 4 and the renewable energy advocates said less, but that was just a guess.
And what tells you that guess?
How I voted.
You should have gotten that link in the chat. Does that ring true to others?
I would agree. I think that it's reflective of largely where we are currently, and I think it's working well, but as we look out to the future, I think that there's adjustments that are warranted for sure.
For me, I will say I was a 2, only because I'm still in a phase of discovery to try to understand what the standard is proposing to be for the future. And I have some operational concerns and thoughts on the fact that I'm not sure that it is aligned accordingly.
And there's more specifics and story behind each of those pieces that I think we'll start to get into the conversation today, both around task 1 and task 2. Other comments, especially if you're sitting online, if there's anything you'd like to share?
And someone said, what does a bimodal distribution look like? I would say, here we go.
I apologize. I'm usually hosting these meetings rather than participating. I'm forgetting where the hand raising button is. I just wanted to add, in terms of folks who, like myself, I put down 2, being sort of a customer representative, particularly in the commercial industrial side. There are longstanding issues and concerns about the costs and whether the way the RES and other renewable systems are set up, whether they create unnecessary increases in the cost of electricity. And that's also a concern about whether things are designed the way they might optimally be.
That may be a good segue to getting into the specifics in a shared document around where you want to bring, where you'd like legislation to put more attention in the statute. I'm going to go ahead and put in the.
I'm sorry, do you mind if I jump in with a quick comment before we move on?
Go ahead.
That's okay. Sorry, I had my hand raised. I know it's very hard to see. I also think that an important concept that often doesn't get discussed when thinking about renewable energy standards in general, or climate solution policies specifically, is the benefit or harm to future generations, depending on how we do or don't structure these policies. So specifically, children right now, grandchildren right now, folks who have not yet been born, what are the costs that will be borne by them, that will be owned by them, if we don't take action to significantly reduce carbon pollution? What will be the state of affairs in their life? What will be the quality of their life? And so when thinking about costs, I think there's a lot more to consider than simply what is a particular number on a particular bill that a particular company has on a particular day. And in fact, this is a much larger conversation about the costs that will be borne by those who come after us, depending on how we do or don't act today. So that's often referred to as the social cost of carbon, if you want to quantify it in terms of a policy, but putting an actual price on the emissions that we produce today and the impact on future generations and the damage that they will have to deal with. So just wanted to put that out there in terms of how to think through these types of policies. Impacts on the youth and the generations who aren't in this room today.
And part of what you're saying, and it's probably the complexity for this working group as a whole, is when you weigh scenarios and options, you're looking at short-term, mid-term, long-term, very long-term, and trying to evaluate a lot of different pieces there. Go ahead.
So Chase, thanks for the comment. Thanks for everyone for comments. And but you're touching on a big question, and I'd say it's my hope and expectation that the economic analysis work that we do will be able to tease out and highlight not just, as Stan was saying, short-term costs, but also the long-term costs and benefits. So hoping that and expecting that we will have a comprehensive economic analysis that's full life cycle, full cost benefit, and we won't distort the picture by leaving out things that you're alluding to.
Let's go to the discussion prompt so we can start to get some of this wisdom on paper and you can figure out how you want to work with it. I put it in the chat, the Google link, in case you wanted to follow along. Those of you in the room don't have that benefit unless you've got a mobile or laptop in front of you to be able to see, but I'll pull it up on the screen. So here is the food for thought. Think about the places, a lot of you have been doing this thinking for a very long time, but in particular, it was assigned between meeting 1 and 2. Think about the places you've identified where the current statute is in tension with your goals for the renewable energy standard. What immediately comes to mind? You might even have a list in front of you that you might be working from. In other words, where are the places that you think the legislature should put its attention for reform? To open this conversation up, I am going to take your comments and try to make some relatively short items in a list of where those tensions are. This is a turn-taking kind of exercise to open it up. I'd like to give each person a chance to speak once before moving on to opening up discussion. Here's my ask, is that you share the top concern, your number one concern. It's fair if someone else has said your number one concern and it's your turn comes up later in the queue to note, that was my number one concern, but please don't speak to it. You can then share your number 2. And that's in the interest of time, because ultimately you'll probably want to speak to many of these different things. And when you get into the mix and context, your time is going to be better spent. Think about what your answer might be while I pull up the Google Doc, and then I'm going to ask for your help, co-chairs, in queuing up comments as we go through. All right. I am ready when you are.
All right, who would like to offer the first point of conversation, your top point of tension?
I'll go since I seem to be a loudmouth today. For me, if we're serious that climate change is the existential threat of our time, the res needs to be about reducing Vermonters' carbon load across all sectors. And implicit in that is doing that in a way that does not unfairly impact low-income Vermonters, and doing that in a way that keeps rates low to further use of electricity for transportation and heating. And I don't think the res has a lot of other goals and objectives wrapped up in it. And I think that needs to be the goal of the res if we are serious about climate change and addressing climate change. So that's what I think.
This is probably very hard to see. What I caught there is impact on low-income Vermonters, keeps rates low for electricity and heat.
Well, I would say that's a subset. That's the second step. I would say the first step is the res should be about addressing Vermonters' carbon load primarily. Vermonters' contribution to carbon load across all sectors, not just the electric sector. And I would say that the second point there is implied in that. Thanks.
Okay. And then I happen to know Representative Sibilia is ready with her comment.
Thanks. I'm not sure if you can hear me. I'm in an airport. I would say for me, it's most important that throughout Vermont, we have continued hardening of our grid and its ability to withstand both climate change and other types of disruptions that might be anticipated that we have renewables that's available in state, that are available to Vermonters to keep the lights on. And so continuing to really build out infrastructure that allows our communities to be okay when larger parts of New England, the US, may not be okay.
Anyone else ready?
I got William online.
Thanks. I think similar to the initial comment, I think one question that we should be thinking about is the goal renewable or is the goal carbon free or greenhouse gas emission free? I think, our concerns primarily are, can we achieve these goals as cost effectively as possible? I think if, we would think that the primary responsibilities on the utility should be affordability and reliability. And then I think the more you constrain their decisions in terms of purchasing beyond that, in terms of scale, siting, technologies, the more constraints you put on that, the more risk you have of increasing costs unnecessarily, even giving the goal of reducing the carbon footprint further than what the current statute already has. So I think, again, technology or renewable versus simply addressing climate impacts is an important question to consider, and that and other constraints, successive constraints for greater granular levels is a overarching concern about how we design these policies.
When you look at how I tried to condense that down, does that look about right to you? Is the goal of the RES renewable or greenhouse gases, climate impacts, and you stressed affordability?
Yes, and I guess the next question is, if you add further constraints within that overall goal, is the cost worth it?
Vote is ready, Jeffrey.
Thank you. For us, it's important that as we're working to reduce emissions, that there is economic affordability in the different options. And there's viability of constructing the correct amount of renewables within the state. It's important as a manufacturer that competes on a globally that we maintain cost competitiveness. It's important as we attract our workforce that their cost of living is affordable as well, and we can attract the employees to the state that we need to do our manufacturing. And I think that flexibility among the different utilities and the solutions that are put forward to the different utilities is critical, as each utility probably has some very different opportunities to take advantage of the overall goal of emissions reductions.
I think there's a nuance there that I missed. So I have economic viability and the impact on manufacturing and employees, and you just added a second piece that I...
And flexibility in how we meet the renewable energy goals.
Speaking to the fact that each of you are positioned in a different place, different locale, different conditions, different pressures.
Correct.
So flexibility in how, I'll just say meet standards.
Meet emissions reductions.
Thank you. Okay.
Brian.
For me, just a little bit of background. I've been more logistically minded in my work history of the utility business. And I have not been so involved at the policy level, stages. From a practicality point of view and an operational point of view that I'm looking at, I take a look at the fact that there are technologies that are desirable, but yet not feasible or practical. that are not necessarily slated to be ready within the time period that we're looking to set these goals to. So I think that there are some limitations in that regard on being able to move to technologies that may or may not be ready yet, both from a reliability point of view, along with resilience, security, and affordability perspective. So from taking a look at all of those items, I'm trying on behalf of the Village of Hyde Park to take a look at trying to establish a diverse portfolio that is going to achieve all of those goals of recognizing on the availability of technology what's going to provide us the greatest resilience and reliability value, affordability, and then also recognizing that the need for security, whether it's physical or cyber, plays a role in any and all of that. And trying to recognize as to how to be able to do all of that within a time frame that is achievable from a policy perspective. Okay. And then there are also my concern is that we have limitations within the physical equipment that we have out on our distribution systems that are going to have to be updated. For example, we have a number of 10 kVA transformers that are not going to work in the new world environment that is desired relative to electrification and all of these other advanced setups. And so we've got to replace all that equipment. How is that equipment going to be replaced? Who's going to be paying for it? How is that going to get constructed? These are all things that we have to take a look at in an effort to figure out what is the proper timeline for success and achievement. Those are the thoughts that I have.
Thank you. Others?
I echo what everyone said about keeping in mind the income on low-income households and accurately pricing those impacts into our analysis. I think I would also, someone who's kind of outside these discussions, would emphasize how changes made to policies, for example, distributed energy production, will impact households in terms of their ability to participate in the general electrification of our homes and buildings, and how the work that we do here might prompt, even outside of this specific working group, changes to policies such as net metering or other things that would affect households and their ability to participate. I certainly don't want to fill up the scope of this project, but I do think that the work here may have a lot of run-on effects that will affect other policies at the household level.
Okay, so there's probably some nuances there that I missed also. What I have is how policies will impact households' ability to participate, but you've added some more nuances that I'd like to catch real quick.
Sure, and I'm not sure I'm the best person to speak to nuances, but in the work that we've done in housing to talk about, for instance, electrifying affordable housing, there's been a big discussion about to what extent affordable housing properties should participate in community solar and how net metering policies might affect their long-term decisions to electrify buildings. That takes us somewhat outside the scope, but I'm thinking, for instance, if there's a push for more distributed energy production in state, that could, impact how households choose to participate and make decisions. So, like I said, this is outside of my area of expertise, but I am assuming that the changes made to the scope of the res could impact how other policies need to be folded in to achieve the goals that are set under it.
If I might, I don't think you are taking this outside the scope. The net metering policy was explicitly part of this project as we talked about in the legislature, so I don't think you are at all. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'm just going to do, a quick reminder of the text of the prompt, and then we'll go to your queue of questions. So again, your number one place that you've identified where the current statute is in tension with your goals for the RES. And if your number one is already up there, it's fair to say so, and then add your number two, but please don't speak to both in the interest of time. So whoever hasn't spoken yet at this point.
If if there are people online, we can't see you right now, so you may have to sing out so we know that you're in the queue.
I can see them.
Oh.
Yep. So we've got-
Superpower.
Why don't we take why don't we take a couple of folks that are online and then we'll come back into the room. So I'm going to go in order from what I see on my screen. I don't know if it's the order in which you raised your hand. Senator Watson?
Great, thank you. So just in addition to the North Star of reducing greenhouse gas emissions that are in the grid, I just want to speak to the need for working on the net metering policy, specifically making it more accessible to folks for behind the meter generation. So lifting some of the caps there. Just making that more accessible. And then and similarly, I believe there's some carve outs for school districts and I'd love to see that extended to municipalities. So I realize those are very specific things, but just thinking about, making it just some specific changes that we could be thinking about for net metering.
So a couple nuances. So make more accessible generally, and then you're talking about carve outs for schools, municipalities.
Schools exist.
Great.
Yep. Thank you.
Ben. That's okay. Ben, we can't hear you if you have to unmute or
Sorry, you said my name very quickly. I wasn't sure I heard that correctly.
wasn't ready. Go ahead.
So, as many others have said, or as Senator Watson put it, the North Star greenhouse gas emissions reductions. What Lewis said about having that, be inclusive of making sure we're allowing electrification and not getting in the way of that is very well taken. I would add that if we're serious about greenhouse gas reductions, then this has to be about getting more new renewables built. And to speak specifically to the question, the prompt, where that's in tension with the current statute is currently only 10%, in the out years of our power would need to come from newly constructed renewable power. If we are merely getting new contracts signed for renewables that would exist without any Vermont policy, we're not actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And that's especially true in a world where we all know we are going to be growing our electric usage. So, in particular, or especially that increased electric usage has to be coming from new renewables. Otherwise, we're functionally displacing someone else's use of existing renewables and not reducing greenhouse gas emissions at all.
Can you take a look at how I've written that up and Ben, make sure that I've got it accurate? So you have the percentage of new renewables required in policy specifically to increase.
Yeah, that's well distilled. Thanks.
So let's take two more online and then come back into the room, and then we'll come back to folks waiting online. Christopher, go ahead.
Thank you. And I'm going to have to jump off, so I appreciate you taking me. Now, I would echo a lot of what's been said, but I think it's important that we also make sure we're thinking about the overall economy. So we talk a lot about rates for these kinds of investments that are effectively public investments in strengthening our grid and getting to 100% renewable. We're always careful to balance progress with rate pressure. And industry, manufacturers, large users are always going to be very sensitive to rates, and that has to inform our work. But the climate crisis has a huge impact on our economy. So cheap electric rates, but then roads washing out, and so industry can't move their products, doesn't strengthen the overall economy, right? So to me, there's this balance that we often overlook. And the res is a unique and valuable place for us to be mindful of that, because when we talk historically about other climate policies, we're often focused on the fact that Vermont is relatively small. And even if we were instantly tomorrow, completely sustainable, the impact on the region's greenhouse gases is, you know, not overwhelming. But the RES is a regional policy, and we are currently falling down and not holding up our end of the bargain, which so to me, it's really important that we look at this and recognize the RES's role in a regional approach and the RES's role as part of building a strong, sustainable economy for Vermont today and 50 years down the line.
Okay, so I'm going to try to distill that. And I'd like you to just look at how I've been writing it down, see if you would make adjustments. So effect on climate changes on the overall economy, RES role and the regional impact on. And here's where I would love a phrase.
Yeah, regional RES role in regional impact on emissions and economic activity.
Okay, thank you. I think I said we take one more online and then come back to the room. Chase, you're up.
Thanks, Jennifer. A lot of really great things have been said. I think Chris just, raised very eloquently the cost impacts that are externalized onto others, towns, folks who need to pay for climate damages when we don't actually reduce the real sources of emissions. And I think that that's really salient. So I just want to underline what Chris just said there. We're all bearing the costs of the inaction of states, governments all around the world. The thing that I really wanted to say, though, in addition just agreeing with Chris, is that the North Star really should be reducing real tons of greenhouse gas emissions. In the real world, reducing real tons of greenhouse gas emissions. The Renewable Energy Standard is the linchpin to all of the other major climate policies that are being discussed, because it will produce, if successful, the clean energy that we need to operate our electric vehicles, our cold climate heat pumps, an electrified economy. And so without a RES that reduces real tons of greenhouse gas emissions in the real world, all of those other policies become dominoes that start to fall. And so really, when Ben mentioned what I heard Ben say about the need for new renewables, that really is key here. Because if we're not bringing on new renewables and we're just using different existing renewable energy sources, we're really just sort of shifting chairs around, if you will, on the deck of the Titanic. We're not really doing anything to change the overall calculus. To change the calculus, we need new renewables to reduce real tons of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions. Thanks.
Thanks, Chase.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to highlight the tension between resiliency, reliability, and the diversity of resources and the location of resources. So as we think about this discrepancy or bifurcation of in-state versus out-of-state, I think it's important to note that from a practical perspective, our in-state new renewable development opportunities is primarily solar. And from a diversity and from a reliability perspective, when we think about growing load, which is growing more in the winter than the summer, there are limitations from a reliability perspective about what that looks like and how we can provide that reliability. That our grids are more connected in New England, outside of the state, to New York, to Canada, and our projections are that we'll actually need to rely more on those, even on an hour-by-hour basis. And that is not the case today. So I think that forward-looking view and that thought about reliability, not just on a, if the power goes out, do you have a generation source close by, but also how are we going to power Vermont in the winter are very important considerations.
Can you let me just, before we take another comment, I want to make sure that I actually got this one. I don't know if you can see that up there. I have resilience and reliability tension with location of resources. Consider the limitations from a reliability perspective regarding load, for example, how to power Vermont in the winter. But you were also talking about where it's drawing from. So what have I missed that you would want to see up here?
I think not just the location of resources, but the type of resources. So the type of renewable resources and the overlapping intermittency of those generation sources. Or not overlapping, that's basically.
Intermittency or not of these resources. Thank you. That's much more specific, and I'm appreciative of the adding. Okay.
Candace.
I want to build on the points that Rebecca made, but then also a lot of folks have touched on what I had as sort of my number one concern, which is flexibility and really wanting to reflect that across utilities and sort of across the different requirements. I think it's important that we build in flexibility that's needed. Because anytime we get too restrictive, I think that's what helps to drive up the cost, and that's something that we're all looking to avoid.
Flexibility in standards or policy.
Well, flexibility in terms of how we achieve the policy goals that we set forward. And then I think also, like I said, building on Rebecca's point, wanting to see a place in the res that allows for new, larger scale, potentially regional renewables or just anywhere renewables, because there isn't really currently a logical landing place for those types of renewables in the current framework.
I'll be brief. I don't think I disagree with anything that I've heard. I'm not sure about that, but I guess I'd go to agree with Jason Ben on our ultimate goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and that's the purpose of the res. It's the important tool we use for that.
And where it comes into tension, you see most of those things listed here. Is there any other thing you want to put up?
Not just.
Well, I would like to add tension around siting. I think we're talking about and learning about Vermont's need to address multiple impacts of both climate change, but competition for land use in other sectors of the economy. And I think increasingly Vermont's role in providing food to the region cannot be lost in addition to other, like biodiversity and conservation needs. So there's a real tension around land use that needs to be addressed and included.
We have a couple folks online too, and then we'll come back into the room in case, just make sure each person has gotten a chance. Heather, you're up. I realize I'm catching you by surprise, those of you who are online, because you're never sure when I'm going to come from the room or when I'm going to catch people standing online. But Heather, if you are, go ahead.
Sorry, I was muted in two places, so I unmuted myself in one and then hadn't in the other. So yeah, I would say that our number one concern is carbon and greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And, to help with that, instead of this focusing on being a renewable energy standard, pivoting to a clean energy standard. And just from a power supply perspective, nuclear would be applicable in that instance, and it provides baseload power, which is something that is very needed. As someone else mentioned, the issues with intermittency and our in-state generation being largely solar. Thank you.
Yeah, so hang on the line for just a minute so that I can make sure that I catch that. And it might be that I'm hearing overlaps and missing some nuances. I think, Heather, that you've underscored a couple of things that are already on this list, but is there something new that you'd like me to take from your comment and make sure it gets up here?
I think the transition away from a renewable energy standard and promoting a clean energy standard.
We do, there's a space for in this discussion to finesse a lot of these different things. But I do want to make sure that we've gotten to everybody first before you start doing some of that work. So if you haven't spoken yet, those are the names I'm going to go to first. I have a couple more folks online that I don't think have spoken, and anyone else in the room. First, Darren.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Are you just fine? Yeah, thanks.
Great. Good morning, everybody. Darren Springer with Burlington Electric. I think for us, in thinking about the renewable energy standard, I'd certainly echo some of the points that have been made around flexibility, not wanting to take resources off the table or make things more constrained. But when I think about our number one priority is, as a 100% renewable electric utility already, focusing new requirements on new load is a principle that I want to introduce to the conversation, because there's a great alignment there where we can say, let's keep the renewable resources that we have in the mix, but let's also then, if we're going to be thinking about new requirements, if we're thinking about new renewables, which some folks have talked about, for us, aligning that with load growth from electrification, so that as we add more EVs and heat pumps, we're serving that load with new renewables, is a really strong alignment from a cost standpoint, from a reliability standpoint, and from a climate standpoint. And the kind of verse of that would be to start saying that existing renewables that we have, that we're relying on, that may be cost effective, have to change to a different type of renewable. That would be something that would be very adverse, I think, for our customers and ratepayers. So that would be my main comment.
I could use some help from anyone in the room helping me decode part of that. Part of it is my own lack of understanding, and part of it is also the audio is a little bit jumbled. But I think
I might be able to help. I think what Darren's bringing up is we have a likelihood in most utility territories in the state that we're going to see increased load, and that any requirements for new renewables should be concentrated on that increase in load rather than replacing existing renewables that already are either owned or contracted with by the utilities for their existing load. Does that help at all?
Yeah, concentrate new requirements on where load is likely to increase.
On increased loads, yeah.
Okay, on increased loads. And
Thanks,
Louis. Hope I didn't butcher that too much, Darren.
That's right. And it's not necessarily under this percentage of new renewables required in policy. It's its own piece.
That any new requirements not impose on the utilities a need to get rid of their existing renewable contracts that they have at relatively good prices, and instead focus on the growth, the load growth, as the place to target for any new requirements.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
Yeah, but I thank you, Darren. Thank you. Shauna, have you gotten a chance to speak yet on this? And there's also Rep. Sibilia. I think you might have spoken.
She spoke.
Shauna, I can't, if you're speaking, I can't hear you. Did you have something you want to say?
Senator Gray.
Well, I appreciate all the comments so far. And I think one thing I haven't heard quite as clearly and emphatically as I'm interested in is the equity of access to clean, renewable power, renewable energy. And I have to dodge something I've said before. One of the interests in seeing us go to a higher level of renewable energy in the grid sooner is that it means that everyone who turns on a switch ends up using clean power.
Is there anybody who hasn't gotten? Peter.
I've heard it, it's been said a couple of times, so I won't say it, but it really is about bringing on new renewables if we really want to stop rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic as far as reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But the thing I would like to ask, what the legislature could work on, what we need leadership on, is balancing the goals of what the public needs and future generations needs versus the needs of today, what the utility sector is advocated for. I mean, legislators we're asking them to take a bigger picture look at what's happening in Vermont now, in society, in the region, and in the future. And that's legitimate public policy aim versus what utilities are going through today. And there's a balancing act there. And we need your leadership on that. I just want to say one quick point that I've heard. I don't know how to phrase this, but I've heard several times that bringing on more renewable energy would mean increased costs to ratepayers. And I don't know if that's actually going to be true across the board. I think that's something really worth looking into is how, what is that really going to look like? It seems to be a fait accompli for some people, but I'm not sure by 2030 or whatever, that's going to actually be the case. So, thanks.
And that balancing is baked into tasks 1 through 8 in particular, comes in towards as you get into the economic considerations and modeling. To the extent that data brings you information and to the extent that your own perspectives and ability to ask questions and add questions to those conversations. Is there anybody who hasn't spoken to this question yet? At least once. There are a couple of you who have your hands raised online. My struggle right now is in figuring out how to spend time on this topic and where you want to pivot to. I'm going to pause and check in with co-chairs first, but just do a time check and figure out where you want to take this.
We're due for a break.
We are due for a break, yep.
I would suggest if there's 2 people with their hands up online.
There are 2, but the question I would have is if there are others of you who would also be able to speak again. I don't know how long that list would grow. Want to hear what people have to say?
Yeah, I would say we should just hear from those folks and then cut off the discussion after that. Take a break.
Sibelia?
Thanks. I think I just want to actually clarify my previous comments and be more specific in my word choice, particularly after hearing from other folks. So climate change adaptation is extremely important and is not actually part of the goals. And so I think that is actually in tension with what we have right now and incredibly important. I would say our other or shared North Star. And if I were to pick a single North Star, that would be it, because climate change is not a future stage. It is a current state. Thank you for allowing me to clarify.
William?
Yeah, I apologize. I don't want to take up too much time. I was almost just going to ask whether this is an appropriate point to flag any disagreements with some of the fundamental presumptions of some of these points, or we're just putting all this on the board and we can debate later.
Yeah, it is. Well, here's where we were going to go next, but I think we need to just check time first. Mm-hmm. The question to all of you at this point would have been, now that you see this up on the board, where do you see adjustments so that I can note some of those nuances under these bullets? They'll get reorganized several times. They don't have to get drafted so that everyone agrees to them, as long as you see the points of tension up there represented. And that is a conversation that doesn't have to be in such a scripted turn-taking manner. We just need enough time in order to actually have it, and you probably are due for a break. So I think my question for the co-chairs is whether you'd like to take a break and reconvene. You can pick this up again in the task 2 section, or you can work with it and pick it up again, either in small groups or at the next meeting. So what's your thinking?
I would go for a break, and maybe during the break, I'd like to look at the list. I don't know if we want to try to tease out some themes yet.
You can, yes, you absolutely can do that as a group even. And I think that is the importance here of finessing some of these words and phrases.
Yeah, sure.
Take a break. So we'll be back at 10. I think that means the live stream turns off for a bit.